Hello, everyone, and welcome to the talk by our presenter, Joel Montvelisky. Joel is the co-founder, test specialist, and chief solution architect of PractiTest. PractiTest is an easy-to-use platform that provides testing teams with full visibility of their testing projects. Joel's talk today is titled Orchestrating Your Testing Process, Coordinating Your Manual and Automated Testing Efforts. So during the talk, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A section. We'll address them at the end of the talk. Don't forget, if anyone's interested in winning the ebooks, to post a question in there. That'll be part of the active participation. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Joel to start, and please enjoy the session.
Frank, thank you very much. Hopefully you can hear me and you can see my screen.
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah, and see you.
Okay, so first of all, thanks everyone for joining. As Frank said, my name is Joel. Let me just hide this in here. And I'm going to be talking to you today about a concept we have been developing in the last couple of years. And I'll introduce it and I'll talk to you about that in a couple of minutes. But first of all, why are you listening to me? Meaning, why not go, and you might still do it, go to any of the other speakers in there. But I'm actually a tester, and I've been doing testing for a little bit now. Actually, when I started doing testing, we were testing the Y2K bug, for those of you who are old enough to remember that. And I've done testing in every single aspect of the world, starting from a junior tester in college, managing a team, directing an organization, stuff like that. After a while, I started speaking in events such as this one, and I became also for a while a consultant. And today I'm working at a company called PractiTest. PractiTest, as Frank said, it's a QA management system. I'm one of the co-founders, and I serve as the chief solution architect, which means that I get to talk to many of our customers. And back in the day, about 18 months ago, I used to travel quite a lot and visit them. And so that gives me quite a lot of visibility into a lot of different organizations where, as it happens, everyone thinks that their problems are singular and very different. But there is a thread connecting to one another. So that's one of the cool things that let me get into all these sorts of weird or cool ideas. Because I'm lucky enough to work for a testing company, then I also get away with doing all sorts of cool projects. One of them is the State of Testing survey and report that I do with my friend Lalit Kumar from Tea Time with Testers. We've been running it for 8 years now, and you can get it for free. Just search for State of Testing. And another conference like this one that we run twice a year called the Online TestCon. But again, you can check it out or contact me. I'll share my contact info later, and I'll be able to give you that info. 2 words about PractiTest, the company that I mentioned. Again, we're a test management system, but it's actually a really nice idea behind it. We're a more modern management system that allows you to more professionally link all the different tools that you might be using, regardless of bug trackers or automation tools. And it's also very streamlined to many of the challenges that we have as testers today. So I'm not going to make this a marketing talk, but if you need a test management system, go ahead and check it out. If you're just interested in looking at it, you're also more than welcome to join. But let's get on with what we're here. Now, there are many misconceptions when people try to understand the relationship between manual and automated testing, okay? Especially if you're not a tester, especially if you don't have a lot of experience in the field, then you might think that manual testing might be like these very nice thoroughbred that it's running very, very fast, but how can you compare it with a Formula One car that has a different engine and stuff? Meaning, if we're trying to judge based on speed, no matter how good and how well-bred and trained your horse is going to be, even on the worst of days, that car is going to beat it. And if this is the comparison that you're doing, then it stands to reason that you're always going to try to say, hey, everything that we're doing manually, we should go ahead and do it automatically. But if you've been around enough, then you know that this is completely wrong. This is not the way that we need to look into the comparison or the complement that we have between manual and automated testing. To me, when I look into manual versus automated testing, I see manual testers as the advanced team, that commando team that when you need to go ahead and get something done, a surgical operation done, then you're going to be sending these guys. These guys are also going to be the people who are going to be leading the job. But when you need to do, again, in this battleship, and you need to have a complete operation, then you will need both the very specific teams and you will need the heavier artillery. And in here, it might be tanks or planes or a navy behind that, or even intelligence that will gather all of the information and do the heavy lifting. So this is what I think that the job of the manual testing is. We need to go ahead and do the very specific testing, the very intelligence, not intelligent, but intelligence-driven testing. And if there are things that we can do with more heavy machinery that don't require that very specific factors, then we can actually employ automation whenever we can on that. And if you think about it, no modern war scenario can be won without the correct and good interaction of these two factors. And this is more or less the same of what we're seeing today on the world of software development and software testing today. Now, let's assume for a second that you agree with me on that. So, okay, all good and fine. We have different type of testing, but what is the big deal when we want to manage manual or automated testing? And maybe more importantly, and let's start with this other question, why is this interesting right now? Meaning, automation has been around for 20 years. When I started testing, there was already automation. But why is it now that it makes sense to talk about this more than ever before? The answer lies on the specific concept of evolution. And evolution comes in many ways and shapes. And evolution is what actually helps everything that we're doing to improve with time and experience. Now, evolution, it's always the convergence of multiple factors together. Even if we look at, let's say, one of the things that I like to tell people, especially young people, the concept of revolution may sound good, but it's always a fast evolution of things. If you think about the French Revolution, maybe, it came because the monarchy was disconnected. There was a very big crisis of geopolitical in the area. But what actually brought everything to life was, or the spark that lit the fire, was that winter had been very, very bad, and there was a lack of food on the streets of Paris. Okay, so you always have a number of things coming up together that actually build up into that evolution or revolution. And something similar has been happening in the last couple of years around software testing, and more specifically around automation. What are these factors? The first one that I want to mention, and obviously there are many, but I'm going to focus on three. The first one has been the changes in automation adoption, and mostly on the automation tools in the market. Now, if you've taken a look in the last 10 years, the amount of tools has not only doubled or tripled, I think it has gone up tenfold. And this is a mix between the free tools, the open source tools, and the commercial tools, even those that are either on top of the free tools or those that are developed independently. We have a lot and many more diversity on the amount of tools you have. So much so that when I go and I talk to customers, they don't have one automation tool. They have between 5 and 7 different ones, especially if you start thinking about 2 or 3 tools that they have for unit testing, and maybe you have a tool for API testing. Sometimes you have more than one. And depending on the technology that you have on the front end, then you might have 1, 2, or 3 different tools. Okay, so that is actually something that we can do. These tools, because there's a lot more competition in the market, they're becoming less expensive. We used to pay quite a lot for each license of testing tools. Right now, we have some pretty decent and good free tools and some extremely well-written, less expensive tools out there. They've become easier to use. So I still think that a good automation script is software development. So you need to have someone who knows testing or software development skills as well. But it's easier to put together and tinker with the tools that we have right now. I think that some advances have been made on codeless automation. I don't think that we're there yet, but I think that we're there on codeless tinkering of automation right now. And last but not least is that automation is becoming more robust. And here we're talking about less flaky tests and less false negatives or false positives that we have in there. So automation has been improving with time. Another thing that we cannot let go is the development and testing process changes, starting, obviously, those of us who started based on the waterfall, then we know how Agile made this great revolution. Instead of 9 months, 12 months projects, we have 2-week cycles. Again, it's not a release cycle, but we can do in 2 or 3 of those very Agile cycles. what actually is changing here is that because we're working on these short cycles, we cannot afford to go unstable a lot. So we have those nightly builds and those CI systems. That CI is that, I call that a clever idea of constantly building and testing the system. Clever in the sense that people think that it's a new one. But we've been doing nightly builds for decades. And the idea of the nightly build is the same that we have for CI. If we make sure that every build is stable, then we're closer to releasing at any single place in time. So that's also something that has been more developed. And if you talk about with people, about 90% of organizations already have a CI thing in place. It can be Jenkins, Circle, Bamboo, GitHub. Everyone is already working with that, and it became a very common concept. And the thing that is actually making a lot of waves lately, it's DevOps. And I think that testers underestimate how DevOps is making a extremely large revolution in the way that we work. Because what DevOps basically is doing, it's like in those 00 movies, 007 movies, where, oh, you have a license to kill, that's your 00. When you work with license to release some bugs out into production. Unlike like we used to happen when we used to ship out disks to people, where even the smallest of bugs was a very big headache. Now there are some bugs that are simply more economical not to find them during testing and let them be found in production and fixed during production. That is because the cost of bugs slipping out has gone down significantly. And again, I cannot go into details right now, but I'll be happy to talk with people about that because it's a very important concept. It's basically saying and limiting the amount of testing we can do before we release to even less than a fraction of what we could have done before. But here, the big question becomes, what fraction do you need to run so that you don't have any of those bugs that you cannot release to production, those expensive bugs, so data-driven bugs that you have there. The last point, and this is an important one, and if you were in Evgenia's session of before, she was talking about how to make developers actually write more user stories and stuff. It's not only about writing user stories. A lot of places where we are, we see a different mix-up of the people actually doing the testing. First of all, Agile, DevOps, we have a lot less testers, but those testers are within the teams. If we have less testers within the teams, that means that those testers have to, A, be more technical, because we will need to do every single type of testing, including the more technical type of testing that we have in there. But also it means that developers are taking a more active role in testing. And I remember going over the numbers of the state of testing survey that we were talking about before. And about a third of organizations are already reporting that the developers in their teams are doing testing. And I think that this number will continue to grow. I'm not going to be surprised if this year we get to half of that people. And as we go more and more into that, then we'll see more developers taking active roles in testing. And that also means that other teams are also taking part in testing. Just as in most organizations, a third of the team are doing testing, a third of developers. We also see a lot of places where customer support is doing testing, customer success is doing testing. You see a lot of other people taking place on the testing mix. Now, this basically says that we have improvements on tools, processes, and players. And this is actually making more and better automated testing in our teams. That is why we need to have more, we need to look differently at the way that things are going to be happening with automation and manual. Now, if we understand that there's going to be more automation, then let's go back to our original question. What's different between automation and manual testing? And the answer is that it's actually quite a lot. It's not something trivial. It's not that we have, I don't know, faster test cases or something like that. We have a number of different things. So let's try to look very quickly into those areas. First of all, we need to understand that even the purpose of our testing when we're looking to manual test and automation test is going to be different. And that's a very cardinal point. That's a very important point. When we talk about manual testing, we're looking at humans that are going to be evaluating the product. We're going to try to find bugs, things that we can improve. This is going to be something that we're looking into a lot of opinions, but also a lot of diversity on the type of things that we're going to be listening. This is the place where a tester might come and say, hey, you know what, you did everything right, but the product still stinks because as a user, I would do it this and this and this way, and it doesn't really fit what I'm going to do. When we look into automation, and I mentioned this a couple of times, usually what we're trying to do is we're trying to reach some sort of stability. The idea of our automation is not going to be so much to find specific bugs, but when an automation test fails, what we need to do is we need to go and see, okay, failure actually says that something was modified. My script expected something to happen that did not happen. Then we need to go ahead and understand what was the issue, if at all. So the approach, the purpose of our testing is completely different. The nature of the test, the way the test actually looks, is also going to be very, very different. If you think about a manual test, it's usually very inexpensive to write. It takes you about 5 minutes, but when you need to go ahead and run it, you might spend on those 5 minutes of test definition about 2 hours, 3 hours of test. Automation is extremely the opposite. It might take you 2-3 days to write that script, but then when you run it, basically it doesn't cost you a thing. It's just press the button and some machine time. Duration of manual test is very long. Duration of automation is very short. Again, if you look into manual, they're usually high-level test cases that are very flexible. The results will depend directly on the tester running it. The tester with more experience might find better bugs. A tester that hasn't seen the system might find newer bugs. Whereas automation is going to be very low-level, not flexible at all. And results don't really depend on the person who pressed the button. So that nature of the test is going to be really, really different. Even the results that we get from our test cases. Manual testers, so you will have a smaller number of runs. Every manual tester will run it maybe 2-3 times. I will usually distribute my test case among the team. If I have a large team, it might be along many people. Sometimes we even give it to our end users to work with. Failed tests usually point directly at bugs or issues in the test, and they're very good for evaluation exploration. Okay, they help us to get a feeling of whether the system is in a good shape or a bad shape. Where automation, you will have tons of results for every, and again, I've seen companies where they have automation and we look into the CI as test automation as well. You might be running that CI between 7 and 12 times a day. And if we're talking here about a project that's run a couple of weeks, you will end up having hundreds, thousands of runs, and it's over a year, you'll end up having even more than that. They are not going to be run by a team. They're usually run by a framework, and you don't distribute it among people. And as we said before, you're not looking at bugs, you're looking at stability. What automation is actually pretty good at, again, and we're seeing that on this last point, is that I can use automation in order to benchmark or certify multiple platforms. So it's going to be a lot more cost effective than trying to do that. Again, multiple devices or multiple web browsers, stuff like that, than doing it manually once you have that test run. So what we need to understand is that, again, on a very, very high level, manual testing is going to be mostly focused on evaluation and discovery, whereas automation is going to be more focused on stability and certification. Okay, so the nature of our tests are going to be very, very different. Now, this is a good point in order to talk about a very common misconception, not only about the test cases themselves, but how the automation process, how do you switch over from manual into automation actually works. Now, especially if you're not a tester, especially if you don't have experience, then you believe that, at least in theory, the switchover from manual to automation or to automation to manual would look something like this. So I started my process before automation. I did some test planning, and obviously I created my manual test cases. And we might be working with manual test cases for months or years. And all of a sudden we say, hey, you know what? Let's actually add an automation tool to that. And we take the same the same manual test cases that we had, and we start automating them. It takes us anywhere between a month to a year. But once we're done automating that, those test cases run forever, and we get magical reports out of that, and we can just let go all of our testing team because we don't need them anymore. If I had a dime for every time I've heard this train of thought, then I really wouldn't need to work on practice anymore. But as we all know, that doesn't really work on the real world. On the real world and in practice, what happens is that usually you start on an existing project, and it has been running for months or years, and you have a bunch of legacy test cases. And those legacy test cases, those manuals, some of them are good, some of them are bad. Usually you have more than you need because in actually to work on them. And so what you do is you say, hey, I want to start with an automation process. So let's first of all do a little bit of cleanup on our manual test cases. Let's define the ones that we want to automate. And then we start automating some of our test cases. And what happens is that we have a framework that starts giving us some, before we even go into automation, we have isolated manual test reports. And so you might have a tool in there, I don't care which one, and you have reports that are relatively good that are giving you the information for your manual testing. Now, because management said we need to implement automation, so we actually go and we do a POC, and we check 2 or 3 tools, and we decided one of them is good. And we actually implement an automation framework out of it. And now we will have, in addition to the isolated manual test reports, we will have isolated automation outputs. And the problem is that with time, we understand that that framework wasn't good enough. And so we just leave it out because it costs more time to write and maintain the test cases than the value that we're actually getting out of that. And you let that project stop for a while. And maybe a new team comes along, or a new test manager comes along, or a new R&D manager comes along. Something changes. And so we understand we need to do stuff differently. And so we do an automation POC, and we realize that part of our problem, as I was saying before, is that you cannot work with one tool because you have different technologies. And so you have 2 or 3 or 4 different automation frameworks that you're going to be using. And then you end up without not only your manual automated reports, but for each one of those frameworks, you also have isolated automation reports for tool 1, tool 2, and tool 3. And what ends up happening here is that after having invested a lot of time, and even if your automation project was successful, then you have isolated reports. And if your manager, the R&D manager or the CEO of the company, comes and says, hey, I want to know what's going on with my testing, then basically you start telling a tale where you're trying to put together all the different results from your automation. And they get a little bit frustrated because they expect you to give them a simple answer. Are we going to be ready to release now or not? And you're not able to give them even that answer, nor to provide data based on that, because it's more complex than that. And you try to explain to them that it's more complex than doing that. And so it's going to be difficult to do it. Now, what this is pointing at is that there is a big challenge in how do you manage that automation and manual testing together. And the challenges actually come, again, from the difference between our test cases. We're talking here about extremely different entities. Automated tests, as I said, they're deeper and more specific. Manual test kits are more extensive and less defined. Okay, so it's basically trying to, it's not about comparing apples to oranges. It's about comparing apples to nails that you're trying to put on the wall. Okay, they're completely different in what you're trying to achieve. Even if we look into the test cases themselves, and if we look into manual test cases, if you're anywhere near all the rest of the organizations, then you're doing scripted versus exploratory test cases, okay? And you're doing a little bit of a combination of both. And sometimes you will be doing regression tests, and sometimes you will be doing new feature testing. Even within manual tests, it's actually very hard to provide one image. And if you look into automation, again, you have not one automation framework, you have multiple frameworks with multiple technologies, and some of your test cases will be UI-based, some of them will be API-based, some of them will be performance unit integration. So again, the variety of things actually is very, very difficult. The second thing that is going to be challenging is the difference in scales. Okay, as I said, you will have orders of magnitude more automated test cases than manual. Why? Because your automations are going to be smaller. So if I have 1,000 automated scripts and I have 100 test cases, how do I put together a report that actually gives each one the way that it needs to be in there? And if we try to say, hey, let's actually look into runs, it gets even more complicated because you need to multiply that by 10 or by 100. The difference between manual and automation. We're talking about very, very different things. Even the timelines of the results that we're going to be having. Your automation cycle should be completed in minutes, maybe hours, no more than a day. Manual tests, it'll take as long as we have. Meaning we have 5 days for testing, it'll take those 5 days. And not because we're running the test again and again, only because we're choosing which tests we need to done. So it takes days to get them completed. And again, we're talking here about many, many different entities. So even if the world is ideal, and I managed to somehow have some sense of that, because we're usually talking about multiple teams and we're talking about multiple tools, then it's very difficult to have a grip on what we're going to be having there. If you don't put coordination in the middle of it, if you don't have guidelines, then no one really knows what test cases do we have, what is running, what has been run more than once, what has been run multiple times. It ends up being a very big mishmash of information. And if you have something like that, trying to create visibility in a way that makes sense and it's easy to do is very, very, very hard to do. Okay, and this is the reality of most organizations, where automation is an ad hoc process that it's inserted after the fact in order to try to improve the way that we work. So how do you fix all this mess? And I'm guessing that many of you are not in your heads and not in agreement, but in sadness, because it's very much what you're doing right now. And what we need to do is basically look at the stuff completely different. We need to have an approach that, by definition, is going to be different. We need to start, first of all, by thinking about what are the desired results. Forget for a second about automation and manual. Where do you want to go? Which are the test cases that you want to run? What type of information are you looking to get? And only then you need to start looking at the different tools that you have at hand. Again, the different type of manual testing, the different type of automation testing, and try to understand how do you want to put together that puzzle. In a sense, it's like when you have a project to build a house, you don't start by building the walls and then you try to put the electricity and the plumbing in it. You need to think about what do you want to do with each one of your rooms and plan that ahead of time. Okay, and that is what we need to do, because otherwise you end up having a house full of patches that doesn't really look well, nor does it actually work as you intended it. But trying to look at a different way, maybe a more artistic way than a house, we need to look at it as an approach where, instead of looking at each one of the instruments that we have, try to imagine again a big orchestra. You actually build it as an orchestra, where you know what you have, you know the different tools, the different type of players that you're going to be having, and you know that result that you want to get to, you know that overture that you want to play. And then you start saying, so this is what needs to be done by the piano, this is what needs to be done by the cello, this is what needs to be done by the flute. And at the end of the day, you get a result that is bigger than the sum of its parts. This is what we call orchestration. And what we need to have is an orchestration of the overall testing process, where we know that our different tools are going to be the different type of testing and the different type of testers that we're going to be having on the team. Okay? Sounds nice, right? But what the heck is he talking about? Let's actually go into that. When we look into the test orchestration process, as I mentioned, we start from the end. We start from understanding, hey, this is the process that we need to, even if you're in the middle of your testing project, if it's a long project, then you want to say, hold for a second, let's do a little bit of planning. And here you want to have either a center of excellence to do the planning, or you want to have the head of departments to do the planning, or you want to have your testing architects doing the planning. And you're going to start by doing that very initial phase of master planning. Now, even master planning is going to be separated into 3 different subsets. The first of them is going to be to define, actually 3 or 4. Let's see. Define the purpose and the scope of your overall testing process. And remember, I was talking about DevOps, and DevOps is going to be very tricky, because when you're working DevOps, you need to understand what do you need to test before the product goes into production, what do you need to test after the product goes out of production, and how are you going to be able to do both of them together? And I have a completely different talk about that. And again, I'll be happy to talk about it later on. But you need to define the purpose and the scope of your overall testing process. Once you have the scope, then you can start by saying, okay, this is better done manually, this is better done automated. And there's a world of different reasons why this one, you may want to do it manually or automated, or a combination of both. You need to start agreeing on those processes. And you're able to break that down into tasks, okay? Those tasks for manual and automation, you need to break it down. And the 4th process in here is to agree on priorities and timelines. What does it need to be done now? What does it need to be before anything else? And all of these you do before you start writing your test cases. That is because you already have the experience, you know what you want to do with the process. And this is something that might take anywhere between 10 minutes on. Again, if you're talking here about a small sprint, then 10 minutes should do. If you're talking here about a larger project, you might need to have more than that. But it's very important to have that stop, think, define before you start moving forward. By the way, this is something that we've seen in teams that are one team, but it's actually has a bigger effect when you have multiple teams working together. Now, once you have the definition, then obviously the different teams and different people will start working on what you have in there. But this is where the coordination actually comes into place, okay? You're going to be having different manual test cases being written and run. You're going to be having different automated test cases being written and run. So you need to orchestrate. You need to coordinate what you have in there. So the first part of that coordination becomes a communication process. As I mentioned, many times the best way to do that is by having a center of excellence around test management, where you do have like ambassadors that go and meet with the rest of the people, and you're able to coordinate the whole process. And the idea of what you want to do here is to make sure that if I'm doing something on team A, team B is going to also be aware of that, and there's going to be a coordination about that. Very, very important. If you want to have order, then things need to be on a single framework, single reporting framework and a single visibility framework. Like everything else in testing, if you have visibility and you have transparency into what you're doing, then it's going to be more organized. It's like basically building a house that doesn't have walls. It only has glass on the sides. Your house will be perfect every single day of the week. Why? Because you don't want people looking up and seeing the message you have in there. It's the same with reporting and visibility. You cannot allow yourself to work dirty and maybe, again, do something fast and cheap. You need to actually work correctly, and that you're going to be achieving by having one single repository and visibility framework. And also, you need to make sure that this framework is going to be fitting every single part of the process. If you have two frameworks, one for manual, one for automation, don't expect it to be easy for you to make sense of what you're doing in there, because you're not going to be tackling those questions of how do I give the different weights to the different systems in there, or how do I put together the different information that I have in here? How do I catalog? How do I make sure that every test is going to be defined for a specific area of the product, or for a specific release, or for a specific user story? Okay. Once you have that integration from scratch, once you have that coordination in place, it will make it easier for that. Now, the last part, it's actually the part that generates the value, but that's also the part that wraps everything up and ensures that you're going to be able to continue working up front. Basically, what happens is that when you have a new process in place, you put a new process in place, you work with that new process for a week or 2 or 3. But when things start getting heavy and you need to make compromises, the first thing that you throw out the window is the process and the order. What you want to make sure is that you're going to be having that process kept together by some external forces. The external forces that are proposed in this process is actually external forces of the people that you're reporting to. So what you want to do, you want to have one integrated quality dashboard that is built on those integrated frameworks. If you have a quality dashboard that you need to make sure to maintain all the time, then you will maintain the process. Think about it. When you start putting your build on a monitor that everyone sees, then the build keeps very much on the green, and you don't start getting those test cases that are read for a long time. Why? Because people ask questions, because you feel uncomfortable. I remember, again, 20 years ago, we did something that I'm not very proud of, but we used to have bug dashboards that say how many bugs were assigned to different developers. Do I think it's a good thing? I'm not sure. But what happened was that if a developer saw that most of the bugs were under their name, then they start actually fixing those bugs because they didn't want to be shown in there. If you have, again, visibility into stuff, you want to make sure that that stuff is going to be maintained, and it's going to be maintained in a good place. Now, it's not only about generating good visibility, it's about making sure that you can generate valuable information for your stakeholders. Now, your stakeholders here are going to be not only your head of development, but also your head of product, head of sales, head of support, people you want to be able to send them information so that they will ask you questions about it. Okay, you want to raise that interest and that visibility. And another thing that you may want to do in your test orchestration framework is not to be afraid of distributing the same information through multiple channels. And that is because of 2 things. First of all, not everyone will be able to read your emails or see your dashboards. And second of all, it's human nature. I read a study where people need to see the same piece of information 3 times until it sinks in. Okay, so you see at one time, it basically, you passes through. Second time, you said, I remember reading about that. Third time, you actually analyze it, and it actually boils down into what you want to do. Okay? Now, I could go a lot deeper into this, and I plan to do, but we don't have a lot of time. I just want to present this idea. What I also want to do is I want you to take a look into the orchestration point and not look at it as basically a dictatorial approach on how stuff should be done. It's very important then when you define the process, it doesn't interfere with the ability to run trials and innovate. Even if you have a centralized process for stuff, most of the innovation around tools, around methodology, around ways of approaching testing will not come from the centralized team. It will come from the end users who have a better idea. They heard about a new tool, they read something somewhere, or they just had a good thought. You want to have the process in place so that if one of the teams has a good idea, it can boil up to the center of excellence, and then you can diffuse it to the rest of the teams. It's not about going out with innovation. It's about centralizing that innovation in place. A very big issue that we see in all automation, even on manual testing, is cleanups and refactoring. You need to add into this process the ability to clean up stuff that is not being used, especially if you have test cases being used by multiple teams in multiple places. You need to have the ability to understand which test cases are good and which test cases are bad, which test cases are redundant, which test cases need to go under maintenance, both for manual as well for automation. Okay, so put refactoring as part of your daily tasks. And one of the things that I think it's cardinal, I've been talking about that integrated testing framework and that integrated reporting framework. The biggest mistake you could make is to say, hey, you know what, it's a nice idea, but we're going to make it a side job for that. When we get around to it, we will do it. Just like, as I was mentioning before, every organization today has either Jenkins or Circle CI or GitHub or Bamboo, because everyone needs a CI system right now. Everyone should have a test repository, test framework, and reporting testing framework as well. Don't make it a side job, because it'll look that way. You will never get around to it because it will never be a priority to it. Before we actually go into questions, and we still have some time to questions, then I want you to keep in mind that there is a balance. There's a big balance actually on integrated testing. It used to be the case around 15 years ago. You used to work with one company, and that testing company, that vendor, used to give you all the answers for that. As I said today, the average company is working with 5-7 different testing tools. So everyone's going to best of breed. Don't think that I need to buy everything from one vendor. One-stop shops are not the way to go right now. Also, the best way to do something, and I mentioned this a number of times, is by having visibility and constant transparency. It actually helps you to have a healthier process. And last but not least, from the get-go, try to understand what information your business has to get from you, and try to provide that testing information up front. If no one is doing anything with the results of your testing, then you're just wasting your time. So this is something that I would also keep in mind. And with that, and with about 6.5 minutes to go, I want to go over to questions. And as I mentioned a number of times, if anyone has any questions, this is the way to catch me. And I'll be happy to answer questions if anyone has them at this point.
Thanks, Joel. That was great. We might hop straight into the questions then, if you're okay with that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so first one from Anya. Do you think separate QA team and separate test automation team is a sustainable solution when industry requires more technical testers?
The simple answer is no. I think that you should have a mix between your manual team or your automation team, but there's a caveat to that. I said this at the beginning, that automation is software development. And so when you look at more complex automation processes, then you have a separation between the people who write the low-level code for your automation and the people who put together the scripts, okay? So if you need to do a lot of low-level automation, how do you instrument a specific point, or how do you create a process? You may want to have a separate automation infrastructure team that they will be taking care of that infrastructure and writing the more complex automation processes. And then you do want to have your automated testing people to be within your teams and actually tinker with that. The concept of 100% manual versus 100% automated testers, I don't buy it that much anymore. I don't think that we're at that place. And again, I don't think that you need to be extremely technical to be a good automation engineer at this point.
Okay. The next one from Paulina. Do you believe manual testing will stay in IT world even after 10 years?
Yes. Very simple, yes. Manual testing is not here to have stability. Manual testing is the most effective, efficient, and cheap alternative we have in order to find whether the software was developed correctly and whether we have bugs in it or not. I was asked once, when do I think that we will stop having manual testing? And I said that we'll stop having manual testing when we stop having manual development. When we have scripts writing code, we will have scripts testing that code. But until we have humans who can make human assumptions and human errors, we will need humans to test those human assumptions and those human errors. So I think that we will need it for sure. And I think that it again, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years from now, we'll still have specific manual testers for that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Okay, next one from Paulina again. Could you please name the single reporting and visibility frameworks?
Okay, I could name Practitest because that's what we're doing, but I don't think that you need to stop in there. Every decent test management system that knows how to manage both manual and automatic testing should help you. Again, I know that that is what we're aiming Practitest to do, but I'm obviously biased because of that. But look into that. Look into manual automation, manual testing frameworks that also support automation. Usually, that's what you need to look into. And again, I'll be happy to show practice later, but no, it wouldn't feel right now.
Okay, next one from Christian. Will the slides be shared afterwards and the recording be shared afterwards? Can they get that somewhere else?
Whether it's going to be shared or not, you need to ask the people from TestCon. If they don't share it and you want the slides, send me an email. I'll share them with you. And again, my email is there.
Okay, we've probably got time for a couple more. From Pavilis, should manual testing and automation be done by one QA engineer?
In theory, yes. Let's break that question down into two. Do I think that the person running manual tests can do automation? Yes. Do I think that a team could have only one person doing testing? The answer is no. I can tell that in my teams in Practitest, then we have a lot less testers than developers. So what we do is whenever we have a user story upfront, we define, hey, this user story is very complex, so we will want to have a tester testing it. This user story is not that complex, so we'll put another developer to test with, to pair test with the other developer in there. And usually you have more user stories than testing time for one individual tester. So if the answer is whether the tester can do manual and automatic, the answer is yes. If I think that the same person can do all the testing, the answer is definitely no.
Okay. And with 1 minute and 30 seconds to go,
no
Peter,
pressure here. Yeah, no problem, man.
How would you sell the investment in automation, tools, and time to management?
Usually what I try to do is I try to explain that your biggest cost in the organization is actually the people that you have in there. So what we want to do, we know that we want to have less people doing testing because we want to have automation in place. So that actually helps you to pay for the automation. But when you want to have a framework, you need to explain that it's not only about doing the testing, it's about how do you put together those reporting in place. And for that, you need to have a framework because you cannot do it manually. Okay, so I usually, what I do, I boil it down to, it would cost us more to have one person doing that manually than to invest in a tool and have it done all the way. It's also a lot more scalable. But usually what I do is I take it down to the people factor, because again, if you go into any team, the biggest section of the budget is going to be headcount, and you can lower headcount by working more intelligently here.
Okay, quick one. What's the ratio of manual to all numbers there, can't you?
42 if you want. No one knows. There shouldn't be a ratio, but it's an order of magnitude different. I mean, if you're doing automation right and you have them small enough, then it's going to be orders of magnitude in difference.
Yep,
Okay.
you wrap that up perfectly. I think we've got about 10 seconds left, so you've done great there, Joel. Yeah.
Sessions later on. Frank, thanks for moderating.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. It was great. So people can get in touch with you. Where's the best place? Twitter, email, or?
My best way would be with email. Again, I don't answer the emails quickly, but I do answer all emails. You can look me out on Facebook, on LinkedIn as well. Joel Montvelisky on LinkedIn. And again, that's my QA blog if you want to read my mumbles sometimes. Excellent.
Right,
people,
we'll
sorry we didn't get to all the answers, but if you send them by email, I'll be happy to answer them as well.
That's great. Thanks, Joel. We'll end the session.
Okay. Bye, Frank. Thank you for everything.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.